Okay, so I was going to go through, I built a thing that I guess you could call something very similar to a model context protocol. I'm live, so I guess I don't need to give the entire backstory, but let's just go over to the Swagger UI. I built a lot of stuff with Fast API, and in this case, what I wanted was, there's a lot of background here. There's a lot of background. I guess it makes sense to start with the graph. So the reason why I mentioned that the graph is important is, okay, there seems to be some duplicate tools, but whatever. I'm just going to pick one. So I wanted a really rich API that enabled me to use a graph, but use a graph in a very specific way. Now, I'll skip over the details, but in a previous role, we had a knowledge graph that effectively, like a data science team, was curating, which makes sense. But I'm very interested in how much you can delegate to like an LLM agent that's running asynchronously. So very quickly, I came across, as someone who was, the lead architect for an autonomous agent platform, I came up with like a system that would kind of have these two worlds, where A, you have a knowledge graph, just a big graph, not even a knowledge graph, just a big graph. And for those who are watching who don't know, a graph is a data structure that is a set of nodes and edges, and the edges can connect the nodes, and so you can model things in this graph-like structure. In this case, you can see, okay, so I have a graph, and there were two big components that are kind of like prerequisites before we can like get to the level of talking about things at the abstraction layer of an object, or like a tool, which is just an instance of an object with a registered schema that exists in the graph. The idea is that when you first, a lot of experiences that are kind of like tangential, but when you hook up an LLM agent, simple CLI agent like this, it's funny because it's true. Like this. This is something that I have that I work with that I call the RL CLI. And it couples a few things. A, an agent that has innate knowledge of the code that led to being in this, basically this text environment. And I can do things like, hey, and what it's doing is it created a conversation. Whatever, there's some formatting. This will eventually return, maybe. Okay, this might not work. I've been messing with this. Yeah, okay, well, I can show you something different in the Green Agent CLI. Green Agent CLI, I need to rename these, but Green Agent CLI is something that's focused on retrieval. And so, for example, my father works currently at NIST. He's worked there for 45, 50 years, and 40 years, something like that. And he has like 150 publications related to his field. And so I have all those publications in a PDFs directory, and I can do something like chat. I'll show you the commands. Now there's a little bug where it seems to register this weather tool, but as you can see, what did I do? So I embedded the input user prompt query. I embedded it. because everything that comes into the system, you want it to have some sort of hierarchical representation that involves embeddings. So something like the more you work with these systems, you hit the upper bound of what's possible within the context limit. And so what you have to do is you basically have to introduce systems that act like pointers to a file. Like instead of thinking of the text of a PDF, you can think of, imagine a deployed web service that has pointers to various locations in the PDF, depending on facets that maybe you don't know until runtime. Just like how they find painted over images on, Renaissance artwork, you don't quite know what you're going to need a reference document for until you actually encounter that use case. And so here it's like a simple retrieval over a document set with, chunk text and embeddings over those text. Now, if you do something like, interesting is, right? Some of these documents that were created predate me, like my birth in 1992. And so that's what I mean. It's like, okay, I know that there was a work trip to Bermuda. So what does the text say about Bermuda? Now keep in mind, I haven't really selected any text yet. There's just this, relatively large, I guess under, I'm not sure the amount of text. I know it's 22 gigabytes of PDFs, I think, because a lot of them are scans, but in text form it's less than that, but it's still something that you really have to do retrieval to actually get the information of it. So this is because I know there's a PDF that has a mention of a conference in Bermuda. So again, I haven't mentioned which text I want. Okay, so 1991, Bermuda trip. As this person mentioned it, contextually with well, in any case, let's reload it and do something like chat. Who is Arthur Collé? And you'll see a hallucination here where, because of the similarity, I guess, in the name of Ronald Collé and Arthur Collé, it, you can see that with the current implementation, it basically hallucinates and thinks that, like I am my father. But what you'll see is, yeah, it does pick up a specific document in the knowledge base that actually is specific to me. Basically a paper I wrote on agent stuff. And it pulls the information, right? So you could imagine that this retrieval process, given that you can either make it, embed, retrieve, surface, you can actually make it equivalent of like a multi-shot over multiple request intervals. So let's do like a relationship query, right? And this is where it starts to get to what I'm talking about with why do we need a graph? Well, a lot of things have relationships, and yes, tabular data, obviously we can store things in tabular data sets and do the exact same process. In fact, one of these examples that I'm running is basically like using SQLite with tables that are like text. Okay, let's see if it finds it. Does Ronald Collé have children? So just like how again, I'm mimicking this flow, but this is essentially just like function calling, right? I'm doing a specific process to elicit a response. Okay, as you can see here, the information is in here. We didn't get it with the first query, but we got it with the second. So you could imagine that there's this async, process happening that's making these, connections, making these inferences across different parts of either one large knowledge graph, big graph, or over many discrete, data stores. So either one is possible. So yeah, that's one implementation of, call all these things like if you're sequentially calling like LLM APIs or VLM APIs or whatever kind of model you want. It's doing some sort of process over time where you're collecting state. Maybe it's retrieving over data that's been chunked and embedded. Maybe it's doing function calls that do things like web search or do something like retrieve files in your Google Drive. All these things are basically you're doing a function and there are side effects. Some of the side effects involve streaming characters to your CLI. Other side effects can involve, I went to an AWS conference and I did a project involving using kind of like prompt engineering and more like software engineering to be entirely frank, but using small sets of, okay, drone can go up from a subset of small atomic operations. You can basically get it to then figure out that, oh, you can, instead of doing two things, you can just specify, you can basically skip having it. And okay, what I mean to say is that, let's say you have a drone with some commands like up x-axis, up y-axis, just movement over one of the axes, right? And you only have like 3 directions you can go in. With the right system design where it can do small of those operations over time, you can, instead of doing in increments of 10, go 10x, go 10z, instead you can do go 0.1x and then 0.1z. So you're doing a smaller scaled operation. And then you can couple those together. So you can kind of teach an LLM agent that's operating a drone. You can take an LLM agent that's operating a drone and essentially generalize lots of small steps into actions. So you can take an LLM agent that has a simple functional interface and basically teach it over time. And this is something I was very interested in. And I'm going to pause this and resume.